I'm really, really honored to have a conversation with one of my masters, Shifu and Jeff Reid, and we're going to be talking a little bit about um, Jeff's experiences in learning Wudang arts from the before time, from the beginning to now, and across different contexts of training,
Mhm.
different kinds of parameters, different kinds of both restrictions and possibilities alongside each other. So could you start with introducing a little bit about yourself,
Sure,
your relationship to Wudang arts?
sure. Yeah, I started training in Chinese martial arts when I was about, I don't know, maybe 19. It's considered kind of late, you know what I mean, as far as like delving deeply into traditional martial arts. But as far as Taoist practice goes, age is not really a restriction. It just depends on what you're practicing at the time. Always from a little kid, I was always interested in other. Um, and Asian culture, specifically Japanese and Chinese martial arts traditions and general arts and religious and philosophical traditions were always really fascinating to me because there was something about the unknown quality and yet the appreciation of the aesthetic of that unknown that I had no context for, which really drew me in a way that was sort of conceptless because I didn't have any context for it. And so looking at things like Chinese calligraphy or Japanese calligraphy or Chinese martial arts, Japanese martial arts, I mean, even down to the aesthetic of the clothing for me was there was something that I saw that it kind of knew my name, but I didn't know its name in a way.
Mm.
And so that was a very, I guess, nascent quality for me from when I was young. And then I started kind of exploring as best as I could growing up in Providence, Rhode Island. Not really exposed to much. I tried, Aikido and karate and Taekwondo. And, I went to a ninjutsu class, which was more of a pyramid scheme than anything else. Um, and then a friend of mine sort of introduced me to a Chinese martial arts school that was in Providence, and it was the one Chinese martial arts school. And lucky me, it was a very good martial arts school with like a very top teacher, and so that sort of started me on the journey of studying Chinese martial arts.
And
So
can I ask about that point? So was there a point where you were kind of doing nothing and then you rocked up to a class, or were you doing something else and then swapped it for Chinese martial arts? And then
yeah,
and then from that point, how could you describe like the incremental journey where the Chinese martial arts became more and more central in your life?
for sure, yeah. I grew up kind of as most modern people do at this point, and I say modern quite specifically. I don't think that there's much of a major division between West and East at this point. There's an author who wrote a beautiful book called Spiritual Vessels, which is impossible to find. And one of the things that he says in it is at this point we live in what's called a consumerist monoculture. A beautiful way of putting it. I guess to me that would be sort of an elaboration on Marshall McLuhan's Global Village in a sense. And so I kind of grew up as that modern person having no real rite of passage. And it almost, I remember a friend of mine saying something to the extent of, the modern rite of passage for people is to not have a rite of passage. So it's sort of like, the modern rite of passage is to be in this sort of nebulous doldrums of spiritual existence or I mean, spiritual is just a word to sort of give a bit of sort of flavor or to the general human experience, which is inherently spiritual. But basically growing up without any context other than being, a young man in, middle to middle upper class America, and I just from a very early age, I was uninterested in the story that I was being fed and the things that I was being sort of prescribed. And so from quite a young age, I started exploring uh, anything that interested me, which was generally whatever I was told I just turned it around, and that's what I was interested in, you know? So, you know, from a really young age, I just started drawing a lot. I was really interested in, you know, really absurdist humor and absurd cartoons like, you know, Ren and Stimpy and all that kind of stuff. But then I was also very drawn to art. You know, as I was saying, I was drawing a lot. I was doing a lot of art at that time, very much into comic books. And of course, comic books are just so infused with Eastern mysticism, Chinese and Japanese martial arts, you know what I mean? I mean, like, just read one Batman comic book, you know what I mean? And it's like, there your journey begins, you know? And yeah, so then as I got older, I started, you know, dabbling more in different kinds of arts and different ways of, you know, encountering the counterculture. So a lot of skateboarding. I started doing a lot of breakdancing and graffiti. I was making rap music for a while. Had a radio show, a hip hop radio show, very, very well listened to. But still there was this kind of void in me. There's, you know, I found all of this stuff to be quite beautiful, but I didn't really feel like there was the kind of depth that I sought out, because I was also, you know, the thing that drew me to rap was words, language, and how playful that you can be with that. The things that drew me to skateboarding was this kind of quality of freedom that you feel. All around expression and all around art. And yet I still felt like there was this kind of, just kind of an empty quality to all of it. And so when I was in university, I started studying, I took a Japanese class, and I did that for a year, and I really loved it, you know, because I felt like I was getting access to something that I'd always quite appreciated. And I tried to, you know, I did capoeira and I did an Aikido class, and I was like, nah, this isn't hitting, you know? And so then I found that Chinese martial arts school. And at the time I had been reading the Zhuangzi, was, you know, my first introduction to Taoism was Burton Watson's translation of the Zhuangzi, which to me is still like one of the best. And a teacher in high school had introduced that to me. And so I was just kind of consuming anything I could about Taoism, which, you know, back then, you know, not much. You can only read so many awful translations of the Tao Te Ching before you're kind of just lost, you know? And so a friend of mine introduced me to the Way of the Dragon, a martial arts school run by Master Wu Wenqing in Providence, Rhode Island. And I went in the first class, I was like, this is what I was looking for. It's this. And so I started devoting more and more of my time. At the time when I first started, I was going to 3 classes a week. And, you know, it was about a 45-minute drive if there was no traffic from where I was in university. And you know, when I finished my first year of Japanese, I was kind of like, well, you know, I was planning on moving to Japan to do, you know, one of the Jan teaching programs or something, just to see like, how deep can I get in this stuff? You know, whatever it is that I was going to get into. I knew that the language was the key, you know, especially a language that's so completely distant from, you know, English. And so I was doing Chinese martial arts, and I was like, well, if I'm doing Chinese martial arts, I should probably be studying Chinese language instead of Japanese. So I started studying Chinese language, much to the chagrin of my Japanese teacher, much to the joy of my Chinese teachers, who really, you know, loved having me in class. And I just started sacrificing more and more of my time to martial arts. I quit my radio show. I quit making rap music. And I just decided I was going to go to Wudang. You know, I knew I was going to go to China. I didn't know what was going to happen. And then in 2005, I met someone just sort of by chance who kind of informed me of the possibility of going to study in Wudang. And Wudang to me was, you know, it wasn't a place that you could just go to. I mean, especially if you're a white guy, you know, from Providence, Rhode Island, you know, like, all I knew of it was, you know, had this kind of mystical quality to it. You know, it's like, oh, that's where, you know, Taoist martial arts, that's like the Holy Land, if, you know, if we're going to use that term. And so I kept in touch with her over about a year or two. And then 2 weeks after I graduated from university, I was on a plane flying to Chengdu. And I was accompanying a friend of mine from the Kung Fu school in Providence. And we went to the Chengdu Sports University for a month. And then I left after that month and went to Wudang. And I just knew that I just had this feeling that when I got to Wudang, I was like, something's going to happen to me, something big. I don't know what it is, but something big's going to happen to me. And so I trained my first 6 months. And then, the night before I left, I was hanging out with my Shifu in his office. And I said, Shifu, I really, I want to make this practice my life, and he said, I know, you don't have to tell me this. And then he said, when are you coming back? And I said, I don't know, I have to go home and get a job. And I said, maybe 6 months, and he said, 3 months, So I was 10 days late, I was 10 days shy of the 3-month mark. Yeah.
Can I ask, with that whole period of time you've described, and I know there's a lot more to come, but even in that period of time, did your template or model of training a martial art change from Rhode Island days to the first 6 months in Wudang? Did you understand what it is to train martial art evolve in some way?
Yeah. When I was in Rhode Island, the first thing that drew me to Chinese martial arts at that time was, watching Donnie Yen movies and watching Jackie Chan and Jet Li movies. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon to this day is still one of my favorite movies. People can't seem to figure out how to make a good martial arts movie anymore. Yeah, and so at that time, I was really interested in traditional martial arts, but for me, when I was younger, I was always very drawn to forms practice, because in that way, when you train in forms in that way, it's in English we call it martial arts, but I think a lot of people don't really understand the depth of what that really means. But to me, since I was a kid, I was interested in art. Like you wouldn't see me without a notebook in front of me and a bag of pens drawing at dinners I would go out to, or in class getting screamed at. And so it was, in a sense, Marshall McLuhan, back to Marshall McLuhan again, once said, the medium is the message. And what happens when the medium of your art becomes your embodiment? And so in that way, the practice of martial arts, by truly devoting ourselves to it in a way, can become a way of making a masterpiece of your life, your way of living. And I think that it's not uncommon that you may encounter that view in reading, even like if you read, Butcher Ding in the Zhuangzi, or, if you read Karate Do, like My Way of Life by Gichen Funakoshi, it seems very, very similar. Or watching Jiro Dreams of Sushi, and kind of seeing how, and this is quite, to me, is quite a Taoist approach, is kind of viewing it as life is cultivation, in all ways. It doesn't matter if you're drinking tea, or if you're washing dishes, or if you're doing martial arts. Simply because I do, Chinese martial arts doesn't necessarily mean that I'm greater or better than anyone else. Someone else, pouring tea, their kung fu may be better than mine. It's just, how do we define kung fu? It's the time that we put into something, and the kind of practice model that we use. We will encounter ourselves in that. One of the things that I often tell my students is that, the practice will reveal itself to you, but only if you're practicing. If when I teach you a new movement, you practice it twice, and then you come back to me and ask me a bunch of questions, you don't have any good questions. You want me to practice for you, And so what I tell them is, go practice and do it 100 times, and then you'll have a really good question, So when I was in Providence, I was very lucky to have such a great teacher, and to also have some great people who were training with me, who had been there for years before, who kind of took me in. And so, I was doing a fair amount of fighting training back then, a lot of application stuff, but then I started really getting involved in the forms practice. But you can get lost in that. There's a phrase in Chinese, lian quan bu lian gong da lao yi cang kong, which means if you just practice forms, but you don't practice gong, which means that sort of foundational, basic practice, build a ground underneath you, then when you get older, you have nothing. Your practice is empty. And so I kind of started getting a little bit lost in it, but my love was still there. But there was still something kind of lacking. There wasn't really a kind of depth to my practice, even though there was maybe a basic I don't know if I would be so vain as to call it talent. There was a natural sort of internal yearning for expression through the martial arts that came through me.